Well, hi, Keith.
Hey there.
So today we are going to get into some new and exciting developments that are happening in regards to access to treatments that we believe can be real game changers for people who've been struggling for, in some cases, decades with difficult to treat conditions, depression, treatment-resistant trauma. We're going to talk about the initiatives happening primarily in what got passed in Oregon and what's happening there, but also the new initiative in Colorado that's on the ballot for November. So tell us a little bit about, why don't you kick us off and tell us a little bit in broad strokes of what is happening in Oregon and what makes the Oregon initiative interesting and controversial?
Yeah, so Oregon passed a psilocybin services ballot, which now we'll start seeing psilocybin facilitators probably right at the beginning of January, mid-January of 2023. So this was a cool and interesting law for Oregon. Just to note that this is a state law, not a federal law, that got passed. So in Oregon, they outlined what they're calling psilocybin services, this is a non-medical model, which is really a non-mental health model, you could say. So what happens is that starting in January, there are licensed facilitators. In order to become a licensed facilitator, you have to be a resident in Oregon for 2 years, and you will need to go through an approved training. So as you know, our training was accepted a few weeks ago to be an approved training. And their training requirements, I'll just go through all the nuances here, and then we'll kind of talk about what this means. So their training requirements is 120-hour training that was approved by the state. They have 12 core competency areas. 30 hours has to be in person of that training. And on top of the 120 hours, you need a 40-hour practicum that's also in person. And that practicum can have psilocybin services in Oregon as part of the practicum, if it's an approved practicum site, but you don't have to be working with psilocybin in a practicum. That can also be through like watching recordings and things. So facilitator can be age 21 or over with a high school degree. And that's the qualifications from the state level, but you still have to get into a program, and each program has different requirements. As you know, our program obviously we gear our program toward licensed professionals, mental health professionals. A little more nuance here is that this is the Oregon, can't remember the name of their department, health services or something department. They are not the licensing boards for physicians or psychotherapists. So this is not run through there. They have told me that the boards hasn't necessarily taken a position one way or the other if a therapist chooses to go offer this. So we'll see what happens there. Okay, so that's that. And then there's going to be licensed service centers. Those applications will be starting toward the end of this year. So you have to be, my understanding so far is you have to be both a licensed facilitator and a licensed service center to offer this. And then there'll be licensed manufacturers of psilocybin. The similarity of, one thing that people might be interested in, obviously psilocybin is a Schedule I substance. federally in the United States. So it's federally illegal to consume psilocybin, or you should say to carry psilocybin, right? But at a state level now in Oregon, it's essentially it's sort of like a decrim effort around giving people these experiences under a therapeutic model, right, in Oregon. So that's really interesting. So similar to cannabis, it's not legal federally. It's now legal at the state level for this particular service. I think that covers the details. Did I miss anything there, you think?
No, I think I just want to highlight a couple of things that you said that I think are really interesting about the initiative there, that, or I guess you could say it's a law there, because now it's not, it's passed and it's happening. One thing is keeping psilocybin services outside of the medical model, keeping it outside of the medical and psychotherapy context entirely, is a really interesting decrim strategy. Because, of course, inside of the medical model, we have doctors and therapists who are licensed on the state level, as you alluded to, particularly physicians who not only have a state license, but also have a DEA license. And so one of the sticky things I think, for physicians in Oregon who are going to get involved in psilocybin services, is this issue of being regulated by a federal agency and DEA, but then operating under applicable local and state law in Oregon. So there is this kind of difficulty there for not just doctors, but also for therapists who are working with their licensure in Oregon as a therapist.
Yeah, it's very tricky, right?
Yeah.
We have a model for this, which is Field Trip in Amsterdam, so one place is attempting to work within a system like this, because it's a very similar situation, except this is a little different in Oregon, because this is actually the decrim effort here is around psilocybin services, this therapeutic encounter with psilocybin in Amsterdam. You have truffles that are legal. So Field Trip does have a model there that, I went and saw, and they're doing this kind of hybrid. We're not practicing medicine. We're a wellness center, but they still incorporate aspects of making sure people are appropriate fit and having nurses on site. So Oregon's different in that there's nothing about, nurses on site and medical staff on site. So this is, I think, an interesting topic for us to kind of explore. What does that mean? How's that going to go? Yeah.
Yeah. And just zooming out for a moment, I think, there's this bigger context that I think is really fascinating around why are these efforts happening at state level and what's going on. And because obviously psilocybin, since we're talking about psilocybin, might as well stay inside of the psilocybin conversation, that psilocybin is progressing through FDA trials. And there is an expectation that there will be a phase 3 clinical trial that will occur at some point. We've been anticipating that now for a couple years. It seems to be slower than anybody hoped it would be, but there are different players involved, not only on the nonprofit side, but also on the for-profit side with Compass Pathways in the UK. And so there's this mechanism for a Schedule 1 drug to become legal at the federal level. But at the same time, you have this very long history of psilocybin in particular being used in indigenous contexts for healing, which arguably outdates Western medicine completely and totally, right? We're talking about millennia of use in Central America and other places. And so I think it's a really interesting philosophical question about whether a natural medicine that's been used for millennia should live inside of the regulatory structure or not of Western medicine. So that's a whole philosophical question.
Right. So for people who aren't very familiar, kind of let's sort of just paint a picture of, before we get more into Oregon, the different ways sort of psilocybin is being used. Historically, we have indigenous ceremonies and indigenous healing practices. We have psilocybin being used in the underground healing world, not just in the US and other places, one-on-one with healers and therapists, and ceremonies with groups, shamans who have trained through different lineages, but maybe didn't grow up in those lineages. We have psilocybin obviously being used recreationally at concerts and hanging out with friends. And so this sort of, and now we have psilocybin. This new piece here is psilocybin in Oregon, which is a non-medical model, but it's a therapeutic model. And someone can be a facilitator. They had this 120 hours worth of training, right? So again, this is another sort of granular approach to how it could be used. And now it's within a regulatory body in the US.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And there are people with, very well-respected, very thoughtful, highly intelligent people who have really strong opinions on both sides of this kind of, if you will, debate or controversy about where psychedelics belong in American, 21st century American culture. And, I read these opinions from people, whether it's Michael Pollan or David Bronner or, any of these very thoughtful and highly intelligent folks thinking about where's the best place for these tools that clearly come with a lot of promise for potential healing for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
And with psilocybin, the range of challenges is pretty wide. Actually, it's more than just depression with psilocybin, showing promise for cluster headaches and OCD and end of life anxiety, and it's particularly helpful for fear of death and cancer and eating disorders. There's all kinds of research going on. So it's a really interesting. I can see benefits and drawbacks to both sides of this argument about that it should be regulated and that it should be taken outside of the medical context, like what's happening in Oregon.
Right, or completely decrim. Right, is a whole nother movement, which is decrim at the state level.
Right.
So,
well, yeah, there is a concern that what's happening with this context that you described that's already in place in Oregon, that is a first step toward, seeing psilocybin sold with marijuana in, kind of a fully decrim state level context.
Well, so let's talk about the different aspects of this. So, these services in Oregon will obviously increase accessibility to a lot of people. Of course, you'd have to go to Oregon if you're not living in Oregon to access this service. But this is I mean, I think overall, my sense is this is a really good first step in this country of, a state taking a stand that these medicines have healing properties that we need to take advantage of, and that we can't wait forever to take advantage of these things in a way that's going to help people. So on one level, I think this stand that Oregon took is really amazing, because they're really moving the needle forward here. It's time to make psilocybin in a therapeutic context available to people. And we don't know if psilocybin will get through phase 3, and when, if, and how. And if it does, it's interesting, right? Because that's strictly going to be in a medical model. Now that when we go through a medical model, like we're doing with MDMA, the benefits of a medical model is you can put a ton of controls in place to how people up to the set and setting and safety, and training. And the level of training is going to be the highest in the medical model, because people have a ton of training once they're in the medical model already. So there's
Right.
there's a lot behind that movement, right? That I think has a lot of merit, clearly, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it does restrict access, as you're pointing out, significantly.
It
And
restricts access. Yeah.
not just from a regulatory point of view, but also from a cost perspective as well.
Yeah. Obviously, the cost of doing anything in a medical model is very expensive.
Right.
Education's expensive for people who practice in the medical model.
Yeah.
Some medical staff is expensive. Clinic staff is expensive. It's an expensive model, more expensive model, right?
Right.
Yeah. And with that said, we'll likely see insurance companies coming online as things get through phase 3 trials. And, that's a different world when things go through a phase 3 trial and if they get passed, and we'll start to see insurance having some involvement over time, probably with these medicines if they get through phase 3 trials. We don't know. We're not there yet. But the medical model has a lot of benefits to it, and it has drawbacks around accessibility, and other things in the medical model. And then with Oregon's model, obviously accessibility, I think, is one of the largest benefits of the Oregon model. And that's a huge benefit,
Yeah.
because there are a lot of people that need this help, and they need it soon. So to me, the question then becomes, there's two factors I think about with Oregon that I'm curious about. One is screening and safety. So I wonder about that we should talk about. And then the other is just the training of the facilitator. So let's talk about screening and safety. What are your feelings on that? Essentially, clients are being informed to self-screen because they're not being medically assessed, right? So they're basically having to be informed about what the different contraindications and risks are, and then they have to essentially rule themselves out as a client. So what do you think about that system?
Well, I think that there's a substantial risk of harm of taking psilocybin without being well informed about what the risks are and who is a good candidate and who isn't for psilocybin use. And then obviously there's a risk of harm in the wrong context and the wrong set and setting, which I think also I include inside of that comment of set and setting, the qualities of the facilitator. But when just for a moment to flesh that out, just for a second about facilitation, I think that, we obviously run a really in-depth training for licensed people who want to go deeper and weave in what they've already been trained in into the best practices, let's say, for psychedelic therapy, for sitting with people on psychedelics. But my own journey as a MDMA therapist and then later a ketamine therapist, I would say that, it's you could think about your training in facilitating psychedelic sessions the same way you would think about your training in graduate school or for me, training in residency. It gives you a basic kit that would hopefully prevent you from harming people and teach you how to screen people properly, but it's not going to make you a black belt in psychedelic therapy. That takes many, 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 many hours of sitting with people and learning and making mistakes and addressing the mistakes. And so my point is that to come back to your question specifically, what are the risks? I mean, I think the concern about decrim, which I think is valid, is that people making decisions, whether they're people with mental health challenges or extremely inexperienced facilitators, that there's just a higher risk of missing something important. And having someone go into a psilocybin experience who might be at a higher risk of breaking open an underlying tendency towards psychosis and having a difficult integration experience from that, or someone who maybe is prone to bipolar disorder, who is now taking something that hits the serotonin system pretty hard and could trigger mania. These are things that tend to get ruled out in clinical trials. And so we don't screened out, is my point. People with such vulnerabilities are usually not included in psilocybin trials. And so the safety profile for psilocybin is excellent in clinical trials, but it's really important for people to understand that the participants in those trials are carefully selected to minimize harm to participants.
Yeah, I think that we will. So, a lot of people are obviously taking psychedelics at this point, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a lot of psychedelic use going on.
Oh, yeah.
So that's real. That's happening. And, as you and I know, we saw a lot of people in our practices that did psychedelics without any container, other than the random one they found themselves in, and had a lot of work to do around that integration. And so that's real when, set and setting isn't held in a way that meets the person where they really need to be met. So I think Oregon's definitely a step in the right direction. And I think there's some real caution around, can you get a facilitator up to speed in 120 hours of training, most of which is online, most of which is asynchronous from these laws, with someone who has no background whatsoever? Not everyone does, but some people will have no background whatsoever in any healing modality. I don't think so. I don't think you can get someone up to speed enough in that short amount of time. But, I think that sometimes we have to look at what's the purpose of something. The purpose is they're not calling this psychedelic assisted therapy or psilocybin assisted therapy for a reason. Because that comes with other connotations of psychotherapy and the person's background and training. And so it's not a mental health treatment, right?
Right.
So, and that's okay, right? That it's not a mental health treatment. And the thing is that it will become a mental health treatment, whether we don't call it that or not, for many people that are coming in with either known or unknown mental health issues. And I think that's going to be challenging for a lot of people that have, not a lot of training, mental health training. And so there's going to be some challenges that arise around that are real. And hopefully, hopefully there's enough awareness in the space in Oregon to make sure people get what they need if things arise.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're making a great point when you bring up that a lot of people are using a lot of psychedelics, and there's an argument for looking at the big picture of how many people are actually getting into really serious trouble with psychedelics, with their mental health. On the one hand, in an unregulated environment, and then on the other hand, how many people stand to gain by dropping these barriers to access. And I think that the pharmacologist David Nutt in the UK was famously highlighted in the How to Change Your Mind book by Michael Pollan, talking about the risk of different drugs. And he got in trouble by being quoted in a newspaper in London saying that riding horses is more dangerous than taking MDMA. But he was actually quoting the facts. He was quoting the actual statistics of what can harm you more. What's the likelihood? So it's important, I think, for people like me who's used to taking a more way more conservative and kind of even more paternalistic perspective about things, that people are out there using psychedelics a lot. And sure, some people do end up in the emergency room, or some people do end up like people I've treated who needed a year to integrate an experience that they had. Or people who got PTSD taking a psilocybin dose and then interacting with police at a concert or something like that. I've seen those people. But when you think about like how big the problem of depression and anxiety and suicide is, and the barriers to access to treatment, it becomes a lot more palatable to consider the risk profile that way, of like, the number needed to do good in the world and what the actual risks are.
Yeah. And we need help. I mean,
yeah,
we're in an unprecedented mental health crisis on this planet.
Exactly.
The rates are not stopping. They're increasing every few years. They bump up and they bump up, and in big ways, not small ways. And so, yeah, we need help. Psychedelics sure looks like can be one solution of many that will help. And the container matters about how they're used. And so this is an interesting experiment in Oregon. It's an experiment that, I'm curious to see how it unfolds. And so I think that mostly it was a pretty great stand that the residents of Oregon took to bring this to pass. And I do think that it's going to be hard to discern, I think, as what do we call it? The user, the participant who's going to Oregon to get this experience. It's going to be a little hard to discern what is this service in their mind. Like, because, people will go there because they have mental health conditions. People will go there because they don't have mental health conditions and they want to go for personal development. And like, it will be a little hard to understand, what does my facilitator actually know and not know? You kind of assume, sometimes wrongfully, that when you go and get treated in medicine, or in the mental health system, your therapist or your doctor is going to know a lot. And again, sometimes wrongfully, they don't know much. But often there is a base of knowledge in that field that you can expect. There's a
Yeah.
base.
Right.
So this is different because you can't expect a base of knowledge. And 120-hour training is fine and it's a good start, but that's a very small knowledge base when you think about the amount of hours behind any type of long-term education. So it's going to be a little confusing, I think, for the person going out there or in Oregon that goes and uses these services of what they can really expect from the service.
Well, I think it's like, if someone came to see me in 2003 when I had just graduated from residency, like I could do med management and maybe do some cognitive therapy, but outside of that, there wasn't much I was thinking about in terms of like actually addressing the root causes of suffering. But you come to see somebody like who I became, 20 years later, 20 to 30,000 hours later of actually studying and getting involved. It's a different experience. And I think people need to approach any service that they go and seek out from that perspective of like, it's going to take these facilitators in Oregon time to get really good at what they're doing. It's just like any craft.
Yeah.
So there's a discernment there that the consumer, I think that's what they're calling them, right? As consumers of services.
I think so.
Okay. You got to be cognizant of the variety of different levels of competence that
Right.
happen for people.
Right.
If I'm going to Oregon, personally, if I'm going to go there and look for a psilocybin facilitator, I'm going to be looking for someone who's got, 10 years at least of experience before I'm going to be willing to sit with them.
Well, there's an interesting nuance here, which is we don't even know how many of these facilitators will end up being therapists and non-therapists. Many of these facilitators may end up being therapists who choose to do this service.
Right.
We don't really know yet who's going to choose to get licensed and whatnot. And so that's interesting. I mean, I think I would say that for people who have mental health challenges, it's probably better to sit with a therapist. And for people who are going for personal development and feel quite stable in themselves, it might be completely fine to sit with a facilitator who doesn't have that background. I think that's, you could say that for, Indigenous experiences that you could go to right now, where if you're very stable, you'll probably be fine and it'll probably be an amazing spiritual experience.
Except for folks who have hidden childhood injuries that, have escaped the attention of themselves and any therapist they may have seen.
Well, that's everyone else. That's everyone. Yes. So maybe you won't be fine.
But there is that risk.
Eventually you'll discover that too, no matter what.
Right.
Somewhere in you. And that's true too. So I don't know. Either way, I think it's a pretty cool thing happening in Oregon. Mm-hmm. And then we have a ballot in November coming up in Colorado.
Right.
Kind of the next round, so to speak, among states bringing in a ballot like this.
Right.
And again, and I want to also say, these are all our interpretations of what's going on in Oregon. Everything is an interpretation of a law, and that's really important to say.
Yeah.
Because these are, first of all, some of this stuff for the facilitator and the service centers, they're not even in law yet. They're still in draft mode.
Right.
The trainings are the only things that have actually got it moved into like a rule. So I just want to say that, this is, you and I are basically interpreting the law after a lot of conversations I've had with Oregon. And it's important to know that because how these things end up on the street and get in practice is an interpretation, so to speak.
Right.
So that's important to note. So now we have Colorado. I think the prop change we just saw to 122, right?
We should probably just call it the Natural Medicines Act, because that's what
we'll call it the Natural Medicines Act. What do you know about the Natural Medicines Act?
Well, so the understanding I have is that this is a very different model from Oregon, actually, because it spans controlled, regulated use that would be overseen by the Division of Regulatory Agencies in Colorado, which is called DORA here, which includes the medical board and the psychotherapy board, and also includes so-called healing centers, which I'm not sure what that means exactly, if that's a non-medical context or what, but it seems like Colorado is trying to do something a little different from Oregon in regards to what the location and context is for the services being provided. But they're also focusing on psilocybin as a first step.
As the first medicine.
Yeah.
And then they're slated in 2026 to review other medicines, I believe.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they're also kind of deliberately, out of respect for the indigenous tradition of peyote, excluding peyote from what would be considered here for legal use. So peyote is a protected sacrament in the Native American Church, and so that medicine is not a part of this conversation.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's an exciting ballot. Let's see what happens there.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, as you said, we've got this sort of state level initiative starting to happen, and there's also a federal. You could almost call it an initiative in terms of going through FDA trials.
Right.
So an initiative at a federal regulatory level that's happening for psilocybin. So we'll see what happens between those two separate. That obviously, if psilocybin, it'll be interesting to see psilocybin eventually makes it through phase 3, which that's probably years away, at least 5 to 7 if it happens. And it'll just be interesting to see what these state initiatives, what's going to happen if that happens.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you said, we're in a really serious mental health crisis, and there's a lot of people who feel like the federal pathway through FDA is not only burdensome and too lengthy, but there's also this other philosophical argument against the FDA pathway for these medicines, that FDA is really not used to evaluating a psychotherapy that is supported by a medicine. FDA is very familiar with the double-blind, placebo-controlled, isolate the molecule kind of model of research. And so I think there's a really interesting argument that, first of all, the argument that studying psychotherapy is difficult to do in a double-blind, placebo-controlled format to begin with. And that's probably a whole nother conversation for another podcast. But I guess it's maybe just best for this context to say that the evaluation of a psychedelic assisted therapy in a phase 3 trial is a difficult thing to do. And right. I think that's one of the reasons why the pathway for psilocybin through phase 3 is taking a while to get going. The other reasons are probably funding, and there's probably other reasons as well. But anyway, the point being that once again, coming back to the conversation that people have been using these sacraments, really, these natural medicines for millennia. And, like any medicine, there is risk to certain people, but there's potentially great benefit. And so one way to look at the state level initiatives is that people, smaller groups like the citizens of Oregon, or, potentially Colorado citizens, are impatient to get in a crisis, to get things moved forward more quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's why we're even having the opportunity, even at the federal, FDA level, to see medications now coming into phase 2 and phase 3, because a lot of people are recognizing we're in a serious situation that we have to do something about, with PTSD and vets and just a lot of different areas where we know we need to take care of people better than we are. So hopefully people keep suspending, biases, old biases that might not apply any longer. And we could keep moving forward here and doing things safely and effectively, as we're kind of ushering a new era of healing with psychedelics. We've had eras of healing with psychedelics. This is a new one. So it's a great time. It's exciting. And anything else to say before we wrap up?
We can put links in the show notes to resources for people to read more about these initiatives, for listeners who want to go deeper.
Yeah, we can also put links about the current rules established in Oregon. It's best to read rules just versus taking our word for it, because there's a lot of details in their rules.
Yeah.
And there's still a lot of details in draft in Oregon. So we'll put some of that in the show notes too.
Great.
All right.
Thanks.